Welcome to Theory of Pets. I'm a passionate pet owner with a drive to help others like me uncover the truth about the pet industry and what goes on behind the scenes. Welcome back to Theory of Pets. For those of you who are new to the show, my name is Samantha, and today I want to talk about all of the misconceptions, I guess, for lack of a better term, in the pet industry. We've dived into these in the past in some of our episodes. I have talked to other experts in the pet industry who have talked about some of the hidden things that we as pet owners need to know in order to provide the best care, the best nutrition for our pets. A lot of products in the pet industry are not as strongly regulated as the products that are made for humans. So we're starting to see a huge increase in the rates of certain diseases, cancers, diabetes being just a couple in our canine and feline companions. And a lot of this is being directly linked to the products that we're using for our dogs. The plastic products we're using, things like chew toys and bowls, are filled with chemicals that are leaching into our dog system. Things like flea products and shampoos are made with chemicals, toxins that are leaching into our pet's system through their skin. And of course, pet food being the biggest one. We've seen so many recalls in recent years and had so many issues come up in the news and the media about different ingredients. They're being sourced in countries that don't have regulations like the United States. They are, companies are using ingredients that are making our dogs sick. And so today, or our cats, it happens with cats too. I always say dogs, but really pets in general. So anyway, today I am speaking with a man named Richard Darlington. And Richard is the CEO of a company called Brothers Complete Dog Food. Now, Brothers makes an ultra premium dog food, and it's kind of an interesting story. The long story short is that Richard has not been involved in dog food his whole life, and in just a moment I'll play the interview for you, and he tells you about the journey that he took to get to where he is now with Brothers. And it's a similar story to what a lot of us have, and if you look on their website, a lot of the people that have started feeding Brothers food have shared similar stories. And we've done it too in our home, and the basis of the story is you're uneducated, you feed your dog a lower quality food, your dog gets sick, you realize that the food maybe is causing some of these issues, you do some research, and then you switch to a higher quality food. So Richard's goal and his family's goal, it's a family-owned business, their goal is to make healthy pet food for pet parents that is very transparent. The company is very open. They source everything and make their food. Here in the United States, they use high quality ingredients. They actually own a store down in Florida where they sell their pet food. And, their goal is to make a high quality food and educate pet parents as much as possible about the benefits of feeding a healthier food, and the true cost of healthy pet food. A lot of pet owners immediately assume that higher quality food is going to come at a higher price. But today you're going to hear some things from Richard about how those costs can be truly compared. And you may be surprised to find out that sometimes a higher quality food isn't all that much more expensive than a lower quality food, because you have to feed more of the lower quality food. And of course, you are going to be saving on vet costs and things like that. So I'm going to let Richard explain that to you. I had a great interview with him. I learned a lot of great information about pet food in general, and of course the Brothers brand. It's a smaller company, so I actually hadn't heard of them before I met Richard and started speaking with him. So I learned more about the company itself and just some of those misconceptions in the pet industry, things, and he talks about some of the things with the rules and regulations in the pet industry gives some really great examples of times when it's misleading to us as pet owners, the things that we are told from these companies. And again, this isn't the first podcast I've done on this subject. This one's a little bit more broad in terms of what it covers, but we've had other guests on as well that have talked about some of those misconceptions and some of that misleading information. So it's really important as a pet owner that you do your research and that you really make your pet's health a top priority. So again, I'm going to go ahead and let Richard dive in and kind of explain some of that to you, just so you know some of the stuff that he does talk about. There's some research and things that he mentions, and there's links to all of that on our Theory of Pets website. So if you would prefer to jump on there and kind of follow along, or get that information before you listen to the podcast and educate yourself, or get it after the podcast, or whatever you prefer to do, it's right on there on theoryofpets.com. And I will recap the interview at the end and just explain that again, where you can find that. So if you're driving and you don't have time to write it down or anything like that, I will come back and touch base after the interview as well. First of all, Richard, thank you very much for coming on the show. Would you mind just starting out by talking a little bit about your story and your background? It's very interesting, and it gives a great background as to how you got into pet food in the first place.
A woman I dated a while ago, had moved down to Florida with her son and was talking about doing something. She always loved dogs and wanted to she had been a single mom of 3. And, it's a tough life. She had her own business and everything, but she wanted to work with dogs. So she went down to Florida with one of her boys. And I'd always wanted to be involved with dogs because basically when I was a kid, a dog saved my emotional life. I mean, if it weren't for my little dog Patches, God only knows what would happen to me. And frankly, I hadn't realized how much I thought of dogs. I mean, I love animals, all animals, but that dog really, really was so crucial. You'll read in the story, the thing about the story is that, and I didn't really go into it in too much detail, but I swear to God, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was something involving angels with this dog, because I don't know how it was possible that it did what it did. But at any rate, it basically, this little dog just kind of saved my emotional life. It was just, its dedication to me was so complete. I think it understood how much I needed it when I was a little boy. I don't think you're ever the same when something loves you so completely. No, I certainly am not. And I always wanted to be involved in dogs. And, in some way just try to repay what that dog total love did for me. So I went down to Florida, chased Melissa down there, and we ended up opening a dog food store.
And that's your the Brothers Dog Food that you are involved with now?
Well, first we opened the dog food store. Melissa was going to open up a doggy daycare. But do you believe in premonitions?
Absolutely.
Well, I've had a couple dozen psychic events in my life ever since from when I was a young boy. And they all came true, every one of them. I would see a picture of the future, and I would get a mental communication about what it was or what it meant or what I was going to experience, and every one of those came true. And I told Melissa about them, but we spent 5 months fitting out a store to be a doggy daycare, and we're ready to open on Saturday. If this was a Friday afternoon, we're going to open the next morning. a Friday afternoon. We went down to Philadelphia and Miami. We're from Philadelphia area. We went down to Miami to have lunch, and I said, let's go down to Miami. We'll have lunch, and then tomorrow we'll open the daycare. So we go down to Miami, and there was a dog food store down there, and Marissa wanted to walk in and just look around. So she was looking around. I walked to the back, and I looked in a freezer. It was like a stand-up freezer with a glass door. And I was looking at the couple kind of sad pieces of frozen food for dogs, and I had another premonition. I don't usually get them when I was older. Most of them came when I was young. And, like I was given this book of premonitions. Well, they still happen, but, all of a sudden one happened. I'm staring in this freezer, and I get this communication, which was, don't open a doggy daycare, open a dog food store. And the dog food store isn't what you're going to eventually end up doing, but you're going to learn something doing that that's going to take you to what you're going to end up doing. It's going to be extremely successful and extremely helpful, productive. So we leave the store and go across the street and sit down for lunch, and I'm like thinking, oh my God, now how am I going to tell these two? Because Marissa was there and her son, who was like 25 at the time. Tell them I just had a premonition not to open the doggy daycare, but to open the dog food store, which would mean another 3 months of work and a few $100,000 more. It just was crazy. But I've learned that they all come true. They're not general. They're very specific things. So I told her, and they looked at me and went, well, okay. So we went back, took it all apart, and started looking into a dog food store, which is what we opened up 3 months later, $300,000 later.
Ugh.
And that basically took all my life savings. So we opened up the dog food store, and we started doing raw, and we did all the high-end foods. But we, reading all the research and everything, it looked like raw was the way to go, and we had like 9 huge 6-foot chest freezers and a few vertical freezers. And
oh, wow.
we brought in all kinds of raw food. In fact, I would make our own raw food. I'd work all day long and then go home, and I had a mixer in the garage, and I would grind up and mix different food and package it for our customers, because we kept pushing raw, thinking, well, that's got to be the best, right? But as time went by, it turned out that most of the dogs would either stop eating it or get a nutrient imbalance, or the people couldn't afford it. But out of the hundreds and hundreds of people that did it, only a few ended up staying with it. And so what happened really with us was an education in the industry, and it wasn't pretty, frankly. It was kind of discouraging to us to find out that these companies that were making dog food were not only not putting good things in the dog food, but they knew what they were doing. They just didn't care. It was just a matter of how fast can we make money. So we kept looking for a dog food company that would make good stuff. And it was so discouraging. Yeah, but we would think, oh God, that's great. We got here's a good company. Let's push them. They have good food, and then we'd find out that they were lying about what was in the food. Either they were putting something in there that they weren't telling us about. But see, they would open up to us because we were part of the industry. I guess they just assumed that everybody kind of knew. I don't know. So finally, after a few years, I mean, you get to know all these people that come into your store. You know, they become family.
Yeah,
you watch
absolutely.
kids be born, and you know, it's your family and their family. It's like we had Marissa and I and her two boys. Her other boy came and joined us, and it was just, I mean, to find out that they were literally lying on the label, saying stuff that was totally not true. I just said, man, I can't recommend this stuff to these families that trust us. They ask us, you know, for advice, and I just can't do it. And so I said, look, either we got to look into making a food that's healthy. I don't know what's involved, but we got to check it out. So we've been doing some research along the way, obviously, just a part of trying to be better at what we were doing. Marissa found a guy who had a PhD. He was an animal nutritionist. He was amazing. He had a PhD in gut biology. And another thing that was happening along the way was I started noticing all these dogs. Remember, I told you my stepdad was a veterinarian up in Pennsylvania. And
Yes, yep.
frankly, you know, he used to see his customers maybe once a year to just check on the health of the dog, unless, you know, there was an accident or something. These people were going to the vet like every month. And I was like, why do you go to a vet so much? And then I started to see that all these dogs had skin conditions. And I said, you know, I had systemic candida almost all my life and didn't know about it. I had gone to the doctors, and none of them could figure out, you know, my face was breaking out. So you'll grow out of it. You know, at one point I turned 50. He said to the doctor, I think we're past that. I think that ship has sailed. Okay? I'm 50. This I'll grow out of it thing isn't a good enough excuse anymore. And I mean, I had a sugar craving, and my skin was always dry, and I was always breaking out. And so, just by chance, somebody said, "Listen, I met this really beautiful blonde. I was single at the time, and said you ought to go see her. I think she's your kind of woman." So I go to see her, and it turns out she's a doctor of Chinese medicine. And she was here from Maui she had a daughter. She'd come here to the United States trying to get some help. So I went in there to see her, and, you know, ostensibly to, you know, just see if there was any interest for me. And so I said, she said, well, what's your problem? And I said, I felt, you know, basically okay, other than having had problems for 30 years that nobody could fix. So she was with me for like 15 minutes, and she said, you've got systemic candida. I said, you know, for 30 years I've been to doctors, off and on. I never heard that term. What's that mean? And she explained it to me. She says, well, your gut leaks, and the Candida albicans, which is a yeast/fungus that's in everybody's gut, gets into your bloodstream, and then it feeds off sugar, and then it craves sugar, and that's where your sugar craving is coming from. And that fungus in your bloodstream is why you break out, and why you itch, and why your skin is dry. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. I'm looking at this woman, I'm thinking, how is someone this beautiful and this intelligent believe this mumbo jumbo stuff? You know, I didn't believe it. I just thought it was so much nonsense. I said, well, how do you know if you have it? What test do you do? And she said, well, you do a stool analysis. I said, well, no one's ever asked me to do that before. So I figured, what the hell? I'm gonna find out. So I did it, and sure enough, I was riddled with candida. So I went back and I said, okay, so you're right. What do you do about it? Thinking, it's got to be some medicine you take. She said, no, you do it with diet. Diet? I'm like, Jesus. I mean, I have to admit I was a complete dingbat. I had no clue that diet could be that important. And I followed her advice, and 6 months later, I was the healthiest. Literally 54 years old, I was the strongest, healthiest specimen of myself I'd ever been. Not kidding you. I could take a 40-foot ladder and throw it up on my truck like it was nothing. And it all was just from eliminating grains and potato and sugar. Just heal the leaky gut. And then the immune system eventually cleared everything up. So now I'm in Florida, and I'm looking at these dogs, and I'm telling Melissa, my God, I swear to God, they've got the same condition I had. They're all got itching and dry skin and hot spots and scooting, and, everything itches. So I said, let me look at what they're eating. It never even occurred to me to start looking at what I assumed that the dog food companies were all acting in good faith and would, just put healthy food in the dog food. So I'm looking in the food, oh my God, Melissa, it's all grain. I mean, this happened within months of opening the dog food store. So that's what triggered the research. So then we started studying and doing research, and I was stunned by the parallel between what I'd gone through and what these dogs were going through. So we had a lot of hundreds of people with the dogs that are just, itching. What do you do for itching? And what do you do for itching? I mean, we heard it dozens of times every day. So I took them aside and I said, look, we'd like to work with you to try and help, clear this up. If you'd be willing, we just want to, start changing the dog's diet and see what happens. So I started to do this project where I would change them, look for foods that had no grain. This was way back before the whole grain-free thing started, but there were one or two foods that started it. And we put them on that, and sure enough, it cleared it up within months. And next thing that happened was, just when we were patting ourselves on the back, is the symptoms started to come back. So we looked at what they were putting in the food to replace the grain, and it was potato, sweet potato or white potato. And sure enough, that was causing the problem. So we started experimenting with getting the dogs completely off of grain potato. And that did the trick. Now, there was, there's more to it in that we went to the trouble of, finding this PhD and those things you can add to the food. But we just did all the years of research of just taking stuff out of the food to see what was causing the problem. Most of the dogs would recover by themselves over time. So when we finally got this guy, he was amazing. And because he had a PhD in gut biology, I realized from my own personal experience that the gut really was the core to the system's health for a mammal. And I mean, I also knew that it's from research that 80% of the immune system is generated in the mucosal lining of the gut. The other thing that's fascinating is that the only thing that separates the gut and the fecal matter from the whole rest of the body is a single cell thick layer of little square cells called enterocytes. Well, they're rectangular, not exactly square, but they're not round. They look like little blocks that fit together. That's all. That's all that separates the gut from the rest of the body, because the gut has to transport the minerals in the food and the broken down amino acids, and it, needs to go through something fairly easily. The problem with that is that when you damage that little one layer, cell thick layer of enterocytes, all of a sudden fecal matter starts getting into the bloodstream, and then systemic candida. Now, everybody's got candida, and women are oftentimes familiar with it because they get yeast infections. It's the same thing. But when you take that yeast / fungus, and it's an interesting animal. It's both. If you overfeed it, it becomes a fungus and takes over. And it's nature's reclaimer. It's like, here's the Grim Reaper come to turn you back into, dirt so that the next generation can grow. But, you don't want that going on inside you while you're alive. And that's what sugar does. And that's what all that grain and potato feeds. It feeds the sugar. Now, they've started replacing it with things like chickpeas and lentils. I mean, these end up damaging the gut. So, it's like there's only a couple things you can feed without doing damage. And that's what we put in brothers, which is either like peas or one of the rare things that doesn't do too much damage. And amazingly, there's this cassava root, which is pretty much a big food throughout the equatorial regions of the world. In societies that use cassava root as their staple carbohydrate for 80% of their carbohydrates, there's no diabetes, no adult onset diabetes.
Oh, wow.
Amazing. Yeah. And as it turns out, the reason for this is the gut bacteria, just to give you some idea, is about 10 trillion cells that make up your body. In your colon, there are 90 trillion bacteria in a healthy colon. But there's 10 times cells in your colon than there are in the whole rest of your body.
Wow.
Not like a thin coating. It's a massive, massive undertaking, and that's where everything happens. And this country, unlike Europe, is just kind of like talking about the colon as like, let's change the subject. But the truth of the matter is that's where health and disease all begin. So focusing on the health of the colon and keeping it, well, most dogs now have damaged colons because they've been eating so much grain and so much potato and so many, even now the new things they're all putting in there are damaging the gut in other ways. But what happens is that stuff all gets through the gut lining and into the gut and into the bloodstream. And now you've got an immune system that's totally overworked. I mean, imagine, every time when you eat food, you eat meat. A dog, for instance, there's one big difference you need to understand right at the start. Dogs and people are way different in this one respect. Dogs don't need carbohydrates to get glucose. We do. Like when I'm working, I could tell the difference by the end of the day. My brain has been using up all the glucose and I need a little shot of something, Dogs have a process called gluconeogenesis. They convert fat to glucose. They don't need carbohydrates. In fact, carbohydrates damage them. When you have high glycemic carbs, now we can give them carbs like the tapioca is the American, what Americans know of cassava. That's what the powder is. Half of that goes through into the gut. It's literally resistant to being digested. So it goes into the gut and then feeds the good bacteria. That's why it's so healthy. So, like if you look at Brothers, it's got, say, 36% protein in the turkey formula. The truth of the matter is, once you pull out half the cassava, it's probably got 46% protein. But I can't put that on the label. That's illegal. But I'm just telling you, that's one of the reasons it functions so good. So when you now go back to a dog who eats carbs that are, food that are 35 to 65% carbohydrates and high glycemic carbs, we're talking rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes. What happens is the dogs, it triggers insulin, and the insulin converts it to fat. This is why so many dogs are overweight. I think, over half the dogs are all overweight. And this is the reason why. They don't need carbs. This nonsense about a dog is basically changed by a few thousand years of living with men. That's not the way, the truth of the matter is, 25,000-year-old gray wolf has mitochondrial DNA that is 99.8% identical to your dog. Or better put the other way, your dog has mitochondrial DNA that's 99.8% identical to the gray wolf. This is after 25,000 years. That's the difference between a white man and a black man, just so you know. It's literally identical. There's slight little variations, but you're basically saying that what kind of dog do you have?
We have a Labrador Retriever and we have a little Beagle mix.
Okay, your little Beagle mix, that's basically a gray wolf in a different shape when it comes to diet. Now, the nuclear DNA is different from the mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondrial DNA is the whole energy transfer system, from food to energy to the cells. That's what has remained the same, and that's basically what we're talking about with diet and energy transfer. The nuclear DNA is what they changed to change personality and shape. And you can do that in a few generations. But the mitochondrial DNA, which is the diet, that's remained constant. And it's actually only passed through the female. And that's what nature does that specifically. So that doesn't change. And we'd have, slight change, and within a couple generations, you'd lose a whole species. So now go back to the part where you're feeding a dog, a carnivore, whose system is designed to eat fat and meat. He goes and eats an animal, and, you've heard the arguments, I'm sure, that, well, sometimes they eat an animal that was eating leaves, and so in the stomach is some, some grain. Okay, so maybe there's 2 to 3%. It's ridiculous, this argument. They eat an animal, they're a carnivore, they eat an animal, it's fat and it's meat and it's cartilage. I mean, that's what it is. And that's what they're designed to eat. They don't need carbs. They just, through gluconeogenesis, I mean, Samantha, if you and I had the ability, which we have to some degree, but if we had that kind of ability to convert fat to glucose, we'd be able to eat any damn thing we wanted. You can eat to your heart's delight, because it takes the fat, converts it to glucose. But, only the dogs can do that. Well, to the degree that they can do it. And nature puts that in there for the reason that, in nature, nobody's feeding these dogs twice a day, these wild dogs.
Right.
So they might go a week without a kill. So they have to have the energy a week from now to be able to chase the animal down and eat it, kill it and eat it, right? So nature designed it so that when the dog, the wolf, the coyote needed energy a week after not having food, it just simply converts fat to glucose, and the muscles have all the energy it needs. So that's a big difference, and it's widely misunderstood. So, people think they can, because dogs have been hanging around people eating carbs, that carbs are okay. I have a 14-year-old son. He'll eat Cheerios or cold cereal 3 meals a day if I let him. Will his body metabolize it? Absolutely. Is it good for him? Absolutely not. Right. Just the argument that a dog can metabolize anything means that it's okay for the dog to eat it is beyond absurd. And you've got veterinarians saying stuff like this. It's a crazy country we live in. I mean, I don't know how well traveled you are, but this country has the AMA has dominated. I mean, have you ever been to a chiropractor?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. They definitely help, right?
Yes.
The AMA will tell you that they don't exist. They're bad. They don't acknowledge that it's any good. I mean, come on. What kind of world are we living in where the AMA, the people in charge of our medical association, don't acknowledge chiropractors as legitimate? You may know a couple doctors that will personally, but the AMA basically says no. So now you got the FDA getting involved in food, and I mean, we all know that they okay drugs and food that are not good for us. So imagine what's going on with dogs. You've got veterinarians claiming they know what to do with food, and they're not trained in nutrition at all, and apparently don't do any of their own research. So you've even got nutritionists. I mean, these are people trained in nutrition that don't understand gut biology. So it's as though they see the nutrients up in space somewhere, not in the actual body. I mean, I've talked to a PhD that's run multi-million-dollar tests for the big dog food companies, because they're always trying to test to see what they can put in the dog without killing it, honestly. So they did all these tests, and to prove that this dog could metabolize certain food. Well, you know what they did? They literally introduced the food straight into the intestines without putting it through the system. And so that was going to teach him something. The fact of the matter is, a lot of these foods, they do damage before they get there. You can't just isolate it. The system's too complex. So that's why the idea of empirical observation is so crucial, and where we really had the gift of having this dog food story, that we could literally observe real dogs, thousands and thousands of them, over years and years. Do you know what the test for dog food is? There's a feeding trial. Do you know the specifics of how that works?
No.
Okay, well, here's how ridiculous it is. If you are going to do a feeding trial to supposedly prove that your dog food is okay, first of all, according to AFCO, all the feeding trial is going to do is prove that the dog won't die if it eats that food for 3 months. That's right in their literature. That's all they're saying. That if your dog passes this test, if your food passes this test, then it means that someone else can feed their dog your food and their dog won't die. They'll take 8 dogs. You have to give them 8 dogs for the test. It's a 3-month test. Basically, they're going to feed these dogs for 3 months At any time during this test, you can remove 2 of the dogs without any explanation. So 2 of them could get sick and start to die, and you could remove them from the test without any notes about that or any reference to it. So now you have 6 dogs left. As long as you feed them that food for 3 months and they don't lose more than 15 or 20% of their body weight, something like that, and they don't die, they pass the test. I mean, they could have hot spots, they could be itching like crazy, they could be going nuts, but you would be given the AFCO stamp of approval that you had an actual feeding trial to prove your food is good. This is because originally, when the big manufacturers saw the FDA coming toward them and the regulation coming toward them, they were pretty sharp. They said to each other, guys, we need to do our own self-regulation and hopefully sell it to the government, which is exactly what they did. They formed a body of basically them and said, okay, let's make up the rules. They made up the rules. So when the different states come and they say, well, shall we pay for all the research, or shall we just accept AFCO, who's doing it themselves? They all accept AFCO. AFCO just happens to be the big guys. So little guys like me that actually make good food are not allowed to say it because they make sure you can't say and what you can and can't say on the labels and in the food. So it's unfortunate that got the fox guarding the chicken coop there, but all this research, I mean, you get these big money companies. I mean, you're in an industry now where unfortunately you have to make a living, but you're going to run up against this time and time again, and it's a tough thing because no dog should be eating grain. And anyone who does any research for any amount of time would find that out, which means, unfortunately, they're making a hell of a lot of money on this food. And I've got a thing I was going to send you called a true cost chart. Basically, as Brothers has designed a whole bunch of stuff in the food as well to be positive. But my point is, Brothers at $84 a bag seems to be expensive. But the truth of the matter is, it's less expensive than probably 80% of the food out there. Because what nobody takes into account, and this would be a great blog article, is how much of this food you have to feed every day. I mean, it's amazing to me because women are usually extremely astute shoppers. And yet, and 86% of this dog food sales, I think, is women, or at least online it is. So when you buy a food, and we're in a store selling dog food, in 11 years, not one person's ever asked me, well, how much of it do you have to give a day? They just look at the sticker price. Oh, this is expensive. It's $84. I'll take the $50 food. Well, the $50 food, you have to give 2 cups a day. The $84 food, you only have to give 1 cup a day. So in the end, you're spending $100 instead of $84, and you're getting a food that's full of rice and crap and grain, and it's going to make your dog sick. And then you can go to the vet, you'll spend another $1,000 or $2,000. And basically, that's the way it's working right now. So when we saw that, we just decided, look, I said, guys, we got to look into making our own food because this is awful. This is just terrible. So we found this guy, and I said, George, I want you to make the healthiest food possible in kibble form because that's what 98% of the dog owners. At that time, I still thought raw was probably the best way to go, although Now I think the best way is brothers with a topper, a raw topper, which is what we do. Our dogs haven't seen a vet for 7 or 8 or 10 years. They don't ever need a vet. They're totally healthy. So basically, we found this guy, and I said, George, make me healthy food. And George said, this guy's been in, at the time, over 30 years, and he's made food for every major company in America, run research projects, everything. He said, well, you can't afford it. I said, well, there's a new thing called the internet. I want you to try. Just come up with a formula and let me see what. So he came back with a formula, and he was right, basically. It was a little too expensive to do the normal way, but we thought, okay, we'll sell it in the store and we'll sell it online and see if we can make it happen. So we started to make it. And sure enough, what's extraordinary was within months, 6 months, maybe 8 months, about 50 to 60% of the stores switched over to it, and the problems were melting away. And we didn't do any advertising, couldn't afford it, didn't have any, but it was all word of mouth. Generally speaking, about 50% of the people that start would get such results that they never got off of it. They stayed on it. Of the other 50%, after their dog got healthy, about half of them would drop off, and the other half that dropped off would eventually come back a few months later, once their dog started getting sick on the old crap that they thought they were saving money on. But basically, it's just a steady growth from happy customers. But the thing that I want to do really long term is try to affect real change in the health and the quality of the food that's fed dogs. The raw thing, what do you feed? Do you feed raw?
I feed, it's cooked, but it's I make homemade dog food.
Okay. Somewhere between that and what most people just don't have the time or the, you've got to be intelligent to do homemade. You can do it for a while, but it's not easy to balance all the nutrients.
No, and we work with a nutritionist to, create recipes, because we have our lab is obviously much bigger than our beagle, so we can't just make one food and feed it to both. You have to, they each kind of do their own diet. Thankfully for me, I stay at home. I work from home, so I have more time than a lot of pet owners. And that's, it is, we do some raw, they get raw bones, and, there is some raw, but it's a homemade diet that, we do have to work with a professional nutritionist that's trained. I think, and you mentioned it as well, because you worked with someone with a PhD. A lot of people just assume that your regular veterinarian is going to be able to recommend things about your dog's diet, but people don't realize that they're a general veterinarian, and their actual canine or feline, whatever animal you have, nutrition education is very minimal. Most of their education is on the things that they do, the most, which are things like spaying and neutering, or, treating common diseases and things like that. They're not actually educated completely on nutrition. So a lot of people don't realize how important it is to work with a nutrition expert and not just your everyday vet.
Right. Well, most of the guy that we use literally takes into account the temperature it's cooked at and replaces anything that's heat damaged. And we put in digestive enzymes, and we actually add more prebiotics, special long-chain prebiotics, so that it feeds the good gut bacteria and not the pathogenic bacteria. Because the cheaper polysaccharides that they put in there for prebiotic, if they're only 1, 2, 3, 4 cells long, then they're usually one or two, then like the candida can actually feed off of it. You want to get a long chain, like 12, 14 chain, and then the good bacteria clogs up each end and then eats from the end in, so that it's only accessible to them and not to the pathogenic bacteria. But then the other thing is the probiotics that are put on there. See, as long as you're willing to do it your way, you can do that. You can add probiotics right at the last minute. As long as the dog eats it up in a few minutes, so you're fine. But all the probiotics that are put in dog food are 99.9% dead by the time the dog eats it. They're literally activated by the warmth and the moisture in the dog food itself. So we found, our PhD guy found this guy, microbiologist up in the north somewhere, Minnesota or Nebraska or something, and he makes a encapsulated probiotic, which he sells to, big farmers and other animals, but he makes one for dogs too. So it's the only one that I'm aware of, but we use it because it delivers about 1,000 times. Well, it delivers 99.8% of the probiotics to the gut, where it's the reverse for regular. It's the kind of thing where they put those probiotics on the label, knowing that they're not going to be alive when the dog eats it. It's just that kind of deceptive practice is, I just find it distasteful. I know it's all about the money and making corporate America happy, but, if AFCO were actually an agency that was trying to do good for dogs, I would think they'd do something about that. But, of course, they don't do that. So the long and short of it is that I don't think it's possible to fix the system, is my guess. You're looking at a couple companies that each do $18 billion in dog food. There's $36 billion right there between two companies. And now Blue Buffalo and another one, they're at $2 billion each, absorbing all this stuff. But unfortunately, there's just no way around it, as far as I can see, Samantha. It's all happening in the gut, and when you look at all these poor dogs that are miserable, and we see them coming into the store all the time, it's just, it just breaks your heart. There's a website that I get. It's like a website for allergies for dogs. And when you just look at the stuff, the photos that people put on there, and all they talk about is what kind of drugs, what's the latest drug you can give your dog, and it just makes me sick. It's just a shame. And the hard part is, a lot of times people will believe, you're just pushing your dog food. And I'll go on there. I won't even tell them I make a dog food to try and tell them what to do. It's not about that. It's about, if you love dogs and you love animals, I just honestly don't see how you can make them suffer. We eat animals. I wish I didn't have to, but I don't do it much anymore. But, it's just part of life. But the suffering part I don't like. Did you ever see that movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy?
No.
It's about life on the Serengeti. And the little people of Serengeti, it's true. This is a true story. And what they do is they'll shoot an antelope with, just breaks the skin, but it's a little sleeping potion and puts them to sleep. And they follow it until it falls asleep. And they say a prayer to the spirit of the antelope for thanking them for becoming part of their family. And they, basically put the animal to sleep without it suffering at all. I mean, that seems to be as good a way as any meat. But you're basically home feeding your dogs, but 98 or I don't know, so it's up there. People just can't be. They can't handle it. They're just going to eat dry food.
Oh.
Basically, what we tell them, huh?
No, go ahead.
Well, what we tell them is, we put them after the whole few years of raw thing. We put them on Brothers because I know that's balanced nutrition, and basically say, look, use a raw topper. Just put a raw topper on it, and then give them a raw bone at least once a week for dental health. And basically, that's worked now for so many years. I mean, like I said, I don't even know a veterinarian. I don't even know one. We don't use any topicals. Systemic flu things. That's basically poisoning the dog system to get revenge on the flu, which doesn't make any sense to me. But
Oh, it's absolutely. I mean, it's easy to see when you look at the statistics over the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, and to see the rates of disease. And it's not just dogs. I mean, it happens in other animals. It happens in humans. The rate of disease just continues to increase. There's more cancers, more diabetes. Even rare diseases are becoming more popular. And, if you look at those trends in the medical side of it, along with the trends in, what we're feeding or the different treatments that we use, like you had mentioned, the flea and tick treatments, and I'm a big advocate against those as well, because it's chemicals and toxins that you're putting on your dog's skin. And if you look, you've mentioned a lot about the pet food industry too, but I preach about that quite frequently, whether it's on in articles on Top Dog Tips or here on the podcast. I often talk about the things that you're putting in your dog's system when he's eating the lower quality commercial foods, the fillers, the additives, the preservatives, all the different dyes, and artificial flavorings. I mean, there's just, the list goes on and on and on of the junk that's in a lot of commercial diets that you're just giving your dog and he's putting right into his system. So it's terrible, and it's certainly, if anybody thinks that it can't be the products that we're using that are making our dogs sick, just look at those statistics of on the medical end of it, and see the huge increase in the rate of these diseases, major diseases like cancer and diabetes and things that continue to pop up. So it's frustrating. I think I see it a lot like you do. Most of the time when people ask me about pet food, very, very seldom, it's probably only happened a handful of times that people have asked me questions about the top quality foods, the more expensive foods. I always hear people say that they can't afford this diet, they can't afford that diet, and so they just choose whatever, the $20 a bag or $30 a bag dog food. And when you factor in the cost of it, like you said, that you're feeding less, which is a huge cost saver, and the veterinary bills. You're not paying to go to the vet because your dog has a rash or is chewing his fur off, or whatever. The ear infections have been linked to different dog food. So I mean, the veterinary costs and the costs of the food and how much you're feeding, if people would think about that, it's certainly, they get that sticker shock initially, but it certainly factors out in different ways. So hopefully the bare minimum that you guys take away from this interview and the information that Richard gave us today and the things that he and I discussed is that you need to do your research. It's so important as pet owners to research let's talk about pet food just because that's what we kind of focused on, but any product that you use with your dog, really research the food itself, the product, the company that manufactures it. If you still have questions, don't just assume that because it's not written on the website, it's not true, or if it's not written on their website, then it must be true. You need to send a quick email, give a phone call to the customer service line, ask the questions that you have. You are the one that's 100% responsible for your dog, the diet that he eats, the products that he uses. If your dog is being poisoned by something, some kind of toxic chemicals, either in the food, in the topical flea treatments, in the toys that he's chewing on, the sad reality of it is it's your fault. It's our fault as pet owners for not educating ourselves, not choosing wisely the products that we're going to use for our pets. And the same can be said for cats, can be said for horses, can be said for any animal that you have. A little bit of research, while it takes more time, obviously, than just going to the pet store and choosing the package that you like the best. It does take more time to get the research done, but in the long run, it's going to save you time. It's going to save you money. You're not going to be dealing with the stress and the heartache and the struggle of having a sick dog. And in the end, it's going to add years to your pet's life. And of course, that's what all of us are shooting for anyway, is to give our dogs the happiest, healthiest, longest life that we possibly can. And that again can be said for all pets, not just dogs. We want our pets to be with us for as long as possible, and it's up to us to make sure that we provide them with the care and the proper nutrients, the proper food, the proper supplies, I guess, to live that long and healthy life. So if you guys have any questions, either for me or for Richard, anything that we can answer, I would love to have Richard back on here. So if you guys have a bunch of questions, leave them on our website, which is theoryofpets.com. You can write them in an email, you can record them, and we will use them on a future podcast. If you guys have questions for me or for Richard, we can get him back on here and have him answer some of those questions for you. If you guys don't mind also just taking a minute to jump onto iTunes and leave a quick review if you enjoy the podcast. That always helps me when I'm reaching out to other experts in the pet industry about coming on the show. So the more great reviews that they see, the more apt they are to come onto the show. So if you wouldn't mind taking just a quick second to review it, I would really appreciate that. Again, feel free to reach out with any questions. There is a link to the Brothers Dog Food website on our website underneath this podcast on theoryofpets.com. And there's also some great resources on there too for some of the products that have been linked to diseases in dogs, some of the chemicals and the toxins, common things to watch out for. So there's a lot of great information on there, theoryofpets.com. Check it out. Don't forget to leave the review. And I will be back next week with another interview. Thanks for listening.